Good day, everyone, and welcome to our Smart Webinar series. In today's webinar, 5 marketing trends that can generate 5 to 7 new leads. And who doesn't need new leads? So the webinar presentation today will be 30 minutes long, followed by a Q&A session. So without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and introduce today's speaker, Valerie Whitman, a Senior Care Executive at Leading Response. Val has more than a decade of experience in the senior care industry. She's worked as a regional director with Benchmark Senior Living and a national senior care operations director at care.com. She is fantastic at helping senior care communities and providers maximize their new resident acquisition marketing dollars and retention strategies using proven traditional and digital lead generation solutions. So welcome, Val.
Thank you, Andrea, and welcome to everyone. Thanks for your time today. We're going to be talking about the top trends that we've gleaned from our senior living clients community event seminars for the first half of 2017. These trends will show you how to gain more leads, more tours, and move-ins, and be able to achieve 5 to 7 move-ins from your marketing events. Let's jump right in. Now, one of the things that you will be receiving is a free trend summary report, and you will receive that via email from Senior Living Smart after this webinar. And just in terms of the report itself, the data used to create this report came from actual responder data from our senior living community events marketed by ourselves and our sister company, RME 360. Additional data was provided by the Direct Marketing Association. And Andrea, I'm going to ask you to just ask the first poll question, please.
Sure thing. So the question for everyone is, do you give a formal PowerPoint presentation during your community events? Please go ahead and select one or more of the following. Pretty easy, yes or no. And we'll give a few minutes for all of the attendees to respond. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. Thank you for your participation and share the results. So very interesting. In terms of do you give a formal, like a PowerPoint presentation during your community events, it was no at 55% and yes at 45%.
Interesting. Okay, great. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about that. One of the trends is that prospects prefer personal presentations. So a recent survey of potential residents and their adult children show a pronounced preference 3-to-1 for presentations focused on lifestyle versus amenities. Attendees want to feel for what life will be like at your community, not just the brick and mortar things. So this is important because you really want to be able to help folks understand what a day in the life looks like. At the end of the day, we all have great amenities in our communities. You know, the brick and mortar is certainly important, but you really want to be able to educate and focus people about what they can expect for quality of life for their loved one. Talking about the culture of the community, the residents, the caregivers, that's really where the rubber meets the road for folks, because we all have beautiful communities, especially with the amount of new inventory coming on the market and the latest and greatest that's available to folks. But it's really about the interaction and who's going to be caring for their loved one. You know, during your presentation, you want to be honest, share stories, and educate. One of the reasons that we find folks really enjoy a presentation is because many of the attendees are visual. It also helps you as a community presenter to have a guide and make sure that you're touching on the key points that folks came to the event to learn about. And so it gives you an opportunity to use it really just as a tool, not to read it verbatim, not to be, you know, an education style format. You want the environment of the room to be very social atmosphere, as well as your interaction with your audience. We do talk a lot with our clients about the presentation because it is critical to be sure you hit on certain things. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the rest of the presentation. But things like having, you know, a 50-page presentation is the wrong thing to do. You want to keep it very minimal, touch on key points, and again, there's that visual aspect that people really like. Next poll question, Andrea.
The next poll question is, where do you get your mailing list for your community events? And please click all responses that would apply. So we're looking for, do you get your mailing list from an internal database or a CRM, an Excel spreadsheet, a vendor purchase list, or you don't use any direct mail to promote your community events. So where do you get your mailing list for your community events? 80% get them from the internal database or a CRM. 55 said vendor purchase list. 25% an Excel spreadsheet, and 15% do not use any direct mail to promote their community events.
Interesting. Okay, great. So let's talk a little bit more about that. One of the trends is regarding the actual list. So building a list beyond age, income, and zip code. So some of this may be very interesting to you folks to learn that there are quite a few data selects, hundreds in fact, that are available that are well beyond basic age and income. So one of the trends that we have found is that when you're only using basic demographics, you know, your typical age, income, zip code, and homeowner data to create your mailing list for your community events, you can expect a response attendance rate of 50% lower than campaigns using a very targeted list approach. And so let's talk a little bit more about what that looks like. When we consider a mailing list, oftentimes we look at just these basic demographics. And so we challenge you to go further than just basic age and income because, one, you have the ability to now that the data exists. It's self-reported data over the last several years, you know, basically from folks going online and filling out various forms through the internet. One thing that we caution you on is if anyone tells you that there's this, you know, great, perfect list for senior living, no such thing exists. You really want to be very strategic in your approach with this. You want to make sure that you're building the right list for your community and for your market. So what I mean by that is, for example, if you have various product types in your community, let's say IL, AL, and memory care. If you're typically full in memory care and you don't really need to generate that many leads for memory care as you do for, you know, IL and AL, then you want to be able to target your focus on the IL and AL prospects. So that's typically going to be a combination of, you know, adult, children, influencers, and potential residents. And then you want to take it one step further and look at what are some of the ailments that you want to be able to target that you know are folks moving in today from other lead sources that have these various ailments. So we all know the typical ones, you know, there's dementia, there's CHF, COPD, Parkinson's. In some cases, some of your communities may have a specific program for certain ailments, like Parkinson's, for example. So you may be wanting to further target specific ailments. And again, that ailment is just one example of additional data selects that are available beyond the basic demographics. So looking at that, a few of the major list providers over here on the left, you'll see, you know, Epsilon, Experian, Axiom. They have the ability to go that much further and hyper-target beyond that basic age and income demographic. So using that example, ailment data, or another example, familial connections, or sometimes referred to as familial ties. That is where the adult child lives in the same proximity as the potential resident. So again, just looking at how can you really focus your efforts, because every piece of your marketing event is critical to its success. So at the very top of the funnel, looking at, you know, who are you targeting, and then what is your message to target them? What is the content of your presentation? And then, of course, the sales execution component as well. So there are two major objectives of these events, and one is to build rapport with people. They're going to be coming face-to-face with you, which is the greatest opportunity for you, and then also be able to educate them, because, again, we know in this industry that there are a lot of misperceptions. There's a lot of room for education and opportunities to help people understand what's available, and also, you know, why should they choose you over their other options. And when I say other options, I don't just mean, of course, the community down the street. It's also home care options. It's skilled nursing options. It's, you know, moving in with family or family moving in with them, you know, all of the various options that they're thinking about. And the fact is that 2.4% is the average response rate for a community event direct mail campaign following the seminar success formula and a list purchased from an outside list vendor. So since many folks indicated that they do use their internal database, I just want to touch on that for a moment. So, it's critical, of course, that you continue your drip marketing efforts to your already bought and paid for leads in your existing lead base. It's also important to note that only about 20% of the leads in your lead base will ever move into senior living, and not your senior living community necessarily, but senior living in general. So again, because of those other options that they have available to them, they may never decide to move into senior living. And so it's important that you continuously cultivate new leads through all of your other lead source efforts, one of which, of course, is the community event strategy. Another thing to note is that, once you've got your target list, it's critical to then have a message in a format that you're speaking to these folks that is in line with their consumer behavior. So with this consumer segment, and when I say consumer segment, I mean the baby boomers, pre-retirees, retirees, they still respond very well to direct mail. And we know that, of course, many people are out there online, they're researching, you're getting many digital leads, but at the end of the day, this is still the greatest way to market to this segment through direct mail. So one of the things to consider is that when you are marketing to these folks, regardless of how you're getting your list, if it's a combination of internal leads as well as purchase leads, you want to consider what you're sending them in the mail. So for example, oversized postcards, which we all get in the mail, are perceived as junk mail. And you can see that according to the Direct Marketing Association, they're read at only a rate of 54%, whereas letter invitation packages are read at a rate of 78%. So again, all of those critical components will play a role in your overall response rate. And that 2.4% response rate is a cultivation of all of the different best practices, those targeted efforts with those ailment data, familial connections, all the way through the best days of the week to host your event, as well as what lands in the mailbox that you'll be competing against when you are sending out your invitations.
I'll go ahead and show the next poll question. Do you openly discuss cost, price, and funding options during your community event presentations? And please answer yes or no. The question is, do you openly discuss cost, price, and funding options during your community event presentations? And here are the results. Very interesting. Yes, 55%, and no, 45%.
Interesting, yes. Okay, so let's talk about that. And again, we're going to go back to some survey data that we've compiled from the attendees of these events for our clients. And of course, money is always a hot topic, right? And certainly no different in senior living. And there are also a lot of misperceptions out there about the cost of senior living and how that compares to the cost of, someone still living at home, paying property taxes and utility bills and just to maintain the home, food costs, all of those things. So it's really critical to talk about that. So in terms of the trend, for the 6 consecutive months, community events that target retirees to learn about the cost of senior living options top the list of highest performing marketing campaigns. And what we mean by that is when we're sending out the letter style invitation packages to invite folks to these events, one of the topics that we mention that will be discussed is talking about the cost of senior living and how people pay for it. So essentially what this is saying is that the topic is very popular. We see an increased response rate when we have this in the invitation, so people know that they're going to attend an event where they're going to learn more about the cost of senior living. And it says, in fact, this topic ranked number 3 or higher in response rates for Q1 and Q2. So as Andrea mentioned when she first asked the question, absolutely always a hot topic. And it's important to give people the information, even though you may be concerned that, the cost is different for each person, right? We know that. It's based on the unit size and the care levels. And, you really don't want to be in an event environment where you're talking specific costs. And of course, that's not the expectation, but people want to get a sense of what is the cost, how do people that live in senior living today afford it? Is it something that my loved one can afford? And so a couple of things that we received from the folks that have attended would be these quotes. So the presentation was great, but I wish they gave more information about costs and payment options. Another quote was, my mom is a Navy veteran. Are there benefits she can take advantage of that can help offset the cost moving into your community? We know we're going to have to help pay the cost of dad moving into a senior living community, but we really don't know how much. Wish you talked about this at your seminar. My mom really likes this community, but there was no discussion of price or cost to live there. We left with more questions than answers. So the common theme here with these quotes is that these are missed opportunities. And oftentimes when you have these folks face to face, if you get the opportunity to have them, you have one chance at providing them some basic information around costs. And so let's talk a little bit about how we can do that. Because again, we know that you don't want to go too far down that road, because then there are a lot of other questions that happen, and Medicaid is typically one of the questions, and you might offer a waiver program in your state, you may not. There's a lot, and you don't want to, of course, snowball in that setting, especially where it's so customized to each person. But you do want to be able to touch on it because, as you can see, people want that information. So give average costs. You can also give a range of costs. Both the potential resident and adult children and their caregivers appreciate the honesty. They understand that it really depends on the specific resident's needs as well as the type of unit that they want. That will also encourage them to connect with you after the event to get more information about truly what the specific costs would be for their loved one. You want to discuss all of the payment options available, including basics of selling a home, veteran benefits, bridge loans, long-term care insurance. Again, you want to briefly touch on these things because as you know, when you work with families one-on-one, oftentimes they don't know about some of these things that are available. I mean, I think veteran benefits are much more popular than they were years ago when people really didn't know anything about them. But don't assume that people have this information because, again, that's why they're there. It's to become more educated in all things senior living and to get a better sense of what the options are. Disclose the impact on cost if there's a change in the level of care. There are two schools of thought on this, and I think back to my early years in this business where everything was included and it was one price per month. And there are still some providers across the country that do offer that all-inclusive price point. But many times we do have different care levels. And so, of course, the cost is going to increase as the person ages in place and they continue to need more care. So it's an opportunity here for you to let folks know that, the idea is that you don't want that loved one to have to move to a higher level of care. Now, at the end of the day, every state has a different regulation and there's only so much that you can do. You can't guarantee that they won't have to move on to skilled care. But what you want to identify is that you have put in place these care levels as an organization because you recognize that folks will have additional care needs as they age. And you don't want them to have to move to a different setting simply because they now need more care. At the end of the day, everyone understands that care costs money. I mean, labor costs are what they are. And so, making sure that they see the value in the quality of life, being able to keep that loved one there in the community, and you being able to just increase the level of care as needed. The bottom line is to be honest, upfront, and empathetic. Again, one of the main objectives of these events is to build a relationship with folks. Let them see you as a resource that can help them through this effort. Talking about options and acknowledging the stresses tied to costs and payments. Again, put yourself in their shoes and understand that this is very much an emotional, complex sale. You know this from working with many families over the years, and it's not something that folks are looking forward to doing. It's not a conversation, that role reversal that they're looking forward to having, but at the end of the day, it's life, and it happens to all of us. Next question, Andrea.
Val, real quick, because this is such like I said, a really hot topic in the industry. Can you discuss how targeted direct mail helps ensure that the people who attend can afford to go to the community?
Sure, great question. So, back to what we were talking about earlier about those basic age and income demographics. So, the approach with targeting these potential move-ins and their families is to identify just kind of a baseline of financial qualifications. And so different from other marketing strategies where you may post your marketing event maybe at your local discharge planning office, at your local rehab, or even in the newspaper, you don't know who those folks are that are going to show up to your event and whether or not they're qualified, financially, appropriate-wise, care levels, all of those things. And so by looking at it from a very targeted approach, you know that the folks that are coming to your event have met that, minimum requirement of, for example, $50,000 in income annually. They might have income-producing assets of over, $200,000, and we can look at all various criteria. And again, that's where it comes down to that customized list for your community. Because if you are, a CCRC life planning community that has a buy-in, typically your financial minimums are going to be higher than an assisted living that has, monthly rent and is in more of a, modest rural area. So it really just depends on what your price point is, what your targeted effort should look like. And then that way you know that the folks that are sitting in your audience have the ability from a financial perspective. They have an interest to learn more about senior living. They wouldn't give you 2 hours of their time otherwise, because these are folks that can afford your services, and they can afford to, just kind of sit back and have different options available to them, whether it's home care or, moving in with a loved one, whatever it might be. So it really ties back to that targeted list approach so that you know that you're dealing with folks that at a very minimum meet the financial criteria.
Terrific. Thanks, Val.
Thank you.
I'll go into the next question. Okay, so do you ask every attendee at your community event to complete an evaluation form? So please answer yes or no if you ask your attendees that come to your community events to complete an evaluation form. Great. We have a great audience. They're very quick on their poll. So I'm going to go ahead and close the poll, and let's share the results. So no, 76% say no, with 24% saying yes.
Great. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about that. Another trend, of course, everybody wants more tours, right? So we find that we need to simply ask for them. But the way that we ask for them is probably a little different than most of us are thinking. And so, a survey of the caregivers and potential residents that attended off-site community events show a 49% increase in book tours if they were given a compelling story, a reason, and a direct invitation to book a tour. So let's think about that a little differently in terms of how we do that. A couple of tips here. At the beginning of each presentation, tell the audience that they will all be given the opportunity to tour the community. At least 4 to 5 times during your presentation, include the phrase, "When you tour our community, you will." Because again, you want to help them understand as you're bringing them through this process that that's the next natural step to take. So they've met your community team, they've built a certain level of rapport with them, they feel more comfortable with them, they're now getting the education during the marketing event, and then the next natural step is to actually see the community. And be mindful of what we had mentioned earlier about brick and mortar. When you're saying, when you tour our community, you will, meet some of our caregivers, be able to talk with some of our residents and get a sense of what a typical day is like for them, versus saying something like, "When you tour our community, you'll see our beautiful dining room." Everyone has a beautiful dining room. That loved one probably has a beautiful dining room at home that she's had for 50 years. So again, you want to make sure that you're really highlighting the value of the community from a lifestyle perspective, not so much from an amenities perspective. Tell the attendees what will happen during a tour and that there will be no sales pressure. These folks attending these events are attending because they would not step into your community as their first interaction with you. So keep that in mind and make sure that they know that when they tour the community, they'll be able to, again, meet some of the staff, be able to communicate with some of the residents, and then, of course, be able to see what the units look like, what kind of services are offered, come in for lunch with mom. Again, don't assume that they know what a tour looks like just because it's, very typical of what we do every day in our business. Use a community event evaluation form at each event, and we'll take a look at what that looks like. We do provide that to our clients as well, and they find it very useful. Give people the option to book a private phone consultation if they're not ready to schedule a tour at the end of your event. This is critical because you need to understand where people are at in the process. Not everyone is going to be ready right away to tour. They may have the obstacle of convincing their siblings. They may have the obstacle of broaching the subject with their loved one. So again, be a resource for them so that you're helping them to that next step, which might be a one-on-one phone call to discuss further. It might be coming in to sit down and talk about finances, and then tour is the next logical step. This is just a sample of the evaluation form. So again, the opportunity exists where, someone might not be comfortable coming up to you after the event to say, I'd love to be able to talk with you more one-on-one, or can I bring my mom in for a tour? By allowing them to, at the end of the presentation, still while they're sitting at the table, fill out this form, and not only from an evaluation perspective, of course, gives you more information on what they thought about the event, but also gives you an understanding of whether they have an interest and the time frame. And you can customize this however you like, but it is very helpful because it gives them a different way to communicate with you, which could be call me next week, or not ready yet, call me in a month, or yes, I'd like to schedule a tour, please call me. Last question, Andrea.
So the last poll question for today is, where do you hold your community events? And please select one of the following. Is it on-site at your community? Is it off-site, or is it other? And the last question is, where do you hold your community events? Awesome. All right, we're going to close the poll, and I'll share the results. So 73% said on-site at the community, and both off-site and other were at 14%.
Okay. Not surprising. Most of us do hold them on site, and that's how we've always done it. Another trend would be that prospects prefer off-site community events. And we want to think about the psychological barriers and consumer behaviors here. So when given the choice between learning about senior living options, caregivers and potential residents choose off-site dinner events over on-site events by 2 to 1. Now keep in mind, it's off-site dinner events. So again, all of these components are critical and all based on consumer behaviors. So we know, for example, that off-site dinner is more advantageous to folks than off-site lunch. And typically it's because that adult daughter is still working and maybe can't get there for lunch, but could get there for dinner. So all of these different things play a role, again, in your response rate and success of your event. On top of that, off-site events generate more tours and move-ins than on-site events. So that might be interesting to you in terms of, well, if you're on-site, you'd be able to tour people versus off-site. Let's take a look at that. This is data from a snapshot in time of when we have on-site events with our clients, and then those that are off-site on the right side. So you'll see that, again, keeping in mind consumer behaviors and psychological barriers, the difference here is that, folks, if all other things are equal, the invitation, the quantity size that you're mailing to, everything is the same except for the location of the event. The on-site events average 1.42% response rate, and the off-site events average 2.61%. And again, that is because people don't want to meet with you as their first interaction on-site because they don't know what to expect. There's that level of anxiety that people will avoid at all costs, versus doing it on-site. They have the opportunity to be in a more relaxed social setting amongst other people that are dealing with the same life situation. So just a couple of pros and cons before we finish up here, on-site versus off-site. So a few things to look at for pros to doing it on-site. Certainly that it's convenient. It's something that we've typically done, as we just saw with the results of the poll question, and that it's easy to book and hold tours. I'll challenge you to think about the tours that you're having for those, because oftentimes it's in a group setting towards the end of the event, or maybe you have the event set up in a way that they're kind of working their way through the community throughout the event. But it's not that same one-on-one tour that is very specific and customized to that family and what their interests and needs are. Some cons to on-site events would be, it is a challenge to bring 20 or more people into the community. It is the resident's home at the end of the day, so that can be a bit challenging. And also you have inconsistent response rate and ROI. How many times are you looking at that RSVP list that's up at the front desk, and it's a week before the event and you only have 10 or 12 people? and all of a sudden you're in panic mode of, let's e-blast people, let's call our referral sources, let's get these flyers out. There's a lot of work involved with these marketing events, so it's important to be able to rely on some, average response rates, as well as at the end of the day, making sure you're getting your ROI from your events. Off-site pros and cons, a couple things to look at here. As we just saw in that data, overwhelmingly higher response rate than the on-site events. It's convenient for prospects, so again, playing to the consumer behaviors, and then also the social dynamics at play. Again, people want to have that low level of anxiety and an opportunity to learn amongst other folks that are in that same situation. Some of the cons of offsite, certainly you do need a bigger budget. These types of events are not your monthly marketing events. These are 2 to 3, possibly 4 times a year. And it's also, from a food cost perspective, going to be more to host it offsite, more like $30 per person versus, a raw food cost of about $10 per person when doing it on site. And it certainly does require, from an event logistics perspective, a little bit more work on the sales team's part, because they have to communicate with the venue, make sure that the private dining room is set up to accommodate AV equipment, that type of thing, when it's not being hosted on site. Just some feedback from one of our clients here on the East Coast. In years past, events were hit or miss. Our communities and direct mail campaigns yielded less than 0.25% response and even less conversions. Since using Leading Response as a trusted partner, we have seen a 500% increase in response rate and an 8 to 10% inquiry to move-in conversion rate. As a reminder, we'll be sending out that free report for the top 5 trends in senior living marketing. And one other thing that we wanted to offer to folks attending today is a complimentary market insight report. And what this is give you some additional information, as we talked about with the targeted list, looking at ailment data, familial connections, adult children, potential residents that meet that basic age and income for your primary market. So happy to send that out to anyone that would like that. And it gives an overview of the Seminar Success Program, as well as some recommendations for event locations that we know from a data perspective have been good in terms of response rates for this consumer segment. So any questions, Andrea?
Yeah, we actually have a few questions. So if a community wants to get a copy of the Market Insight Report, and it is has a lot of great and valuable information, what's the best way? Should they reach out to you? What's the best way to get that?
Sure, absolutely. So my contact information is here. They can reach out to us via the website. Our information is on the Senior Living Smart member page as well, so they can certainly reach out there. So however they're comfortable reaching out is fine. We can certainly get to work for them on pulling that data.
What is a good size for an audience for these types of events?
Sure. So, a good size, we would recommend about a max of, 45 or 50, depending on the venue and, how many they can accommodate comfortably. Because one of the aspects of this offsite event is to have it be social in nature, you don't want it to be 100 people in the room, because then you will lose some of that socialization. And it also is a little bit more challenging for you as a community team member to be able to build a rapport and have some face-to-face time with all of the folks that are in attendance. One of the things to keep in mind is that these marketing events, and again, this is one of the best practices that we see, is that they're typically over the course of 2 or 3 evenings. So again, from a consumer behavior perspective, when the invitation goes out, you want to give them an option of 2 dates, because they may have a conflict with one date. And so if you're sending out an invitation and it only has 1 date, that person may have had an interest, but they may just have that scheduling conflict. They are not going to call you and say, I'd love to attend, but I just can't make this date. Instead, they won't respond at all, and the invitation will go in the trash. So unfortunately, the reality is you have to understand from a consumer behavior perspective, and that will increase your response rate, but also it gives you an opportunity to have that smaller group, 45 to 50 on each evening, so that you can cultivate that relationship that much more.
Terrific. Thanks, Val. Another question, how frequently should you run an event?
Sure, great question. So as we mentioned before, these are not your typical marketing events that you would host every month. Many of you are having to host, might be 2 a month. One is targeted towards professionals and one targeted towards consumers. So this is more of an event where you're going to have an influx of leads. Again, with that 2.4% response rate, a typical mailing of 7,500 mailers, that equates to, 180 people, which, of course, they're going to have a guest with them that might be an adult child influencer or potential resident. So we look at about 60% of those 180 to be actual leads, which is about 110. So just from a data perspective, that's what you can expect for leads. So that's an enormous amount of leads to cultivate from one event, which is why we don't recommend it to be something once a month. So you would typically have it once a quarter if you're in a lease-up building, or 2 to 3 times a year for a more established community.
Okay, great. Another question just came in. On the invitation, do you make it clear that this is about senior living?
Excellent point. Yes, we do. You definitely want to be very clear and transparent with the invitation. Let them know that they're going to be learning about senior living. Some of our clients will call it retirement living. That's another thing that we really focus heavily on is the content, and we know based on data what is the best content. We heard about the cost being one of the most important topics that we see the highest response rate for the invitations that say that, come and learn about the cost of senior living. And of course, that's not the only call to action. There are other topics that they're going to learn about, but that is a critical component that people just don't have enough information about. So yes, you definitely want to make sure that they know that they're going to be learning about senior living.
Great. We know that today the market is very different than 10, 15 years ago. It's almost like a new reality. Communities are not just marketing for residents, they're competing for new residents. How do what you recommend in terms of offsite events, how is that more effective in being able to be the top competitor for new residents?
Sure. So it's taking a different approach because you're meeting people where they're at, and again, and it's all about the consumer behaviors and psychological barriers. And so when you're asking people to come on site to an event where you may be talking about the same exact things as you would be off-site, your presentation is exactly the same, but you're not meeting people where they're at and talking to them in an environment that is comfortable for them. And so those are the folks that will attend off-site that will not come on site and tour. Now, if they're in an acute situation and mom's being discharged Friday and she can't go home anymore, then of course they're going to walk in your doors because now they're in that acute situation. And you're always going to have a certain amount of leads that are in that situation. But you want to be able to educate folks and help them along the way, because we also know that this is very much about relationship sales and people feeling a connection with you and your community and a comfort level with what they see and feel, but you've got to get to that point. So getting to that point starts with meeting them where they're at, and that's off-site, as we've seen in the data.
Another question came in. Do you recommend PowerPoint-style visual aids, basic handouts, or what do you recommend as kind of that presentation format?
Great question. Some of this is, based on preference, right? And so you want to make sure that you are building a relationship and a connection and engaging your audience. And so we have some clients that will have just a few slides with a PowerPoint, and they'll also have handouts. And we do recommend both, but, it comes down to making sure that you've got the information for your audience, but also that you can deliver it in a way that you're comfortable, because at the end of the day, you want them to feel comfortable with you and your team members, so that you're continuing to cultivate that lead after the event. So the PowerPoint presentation, typically we recommend it to be, just there for visual aid and talking points for you as the presenter. We do see many of our clients provide some handouts because, again, it's an informative evening. People know that when they receive the invitation. They're expecting to be able to leave the room and feel like they have more education than they did before. It's always a balance of, you do not want this to be a sales presentation. That's what they're expecting when they walk in. You want them to be happily, surprised as they leave that that's not, in fact, what happened, that they receive the information, they feel better about, senior living in general, and they're ready to take whatever next natural step makes sense for their situation. So we do recommend certainly having some materials for them, and just keep it low key. Don't be, too aggressive from a sales perspective.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Val. We have one more question. Our community is AL and memory without IL. Does this offsite format work at that level, or does this speak to IL folks only?
Great question. Absolutely. It speaks to all product types. We really don't work too much with skilled care, but in the true sense of senior living, where it's, anywhere from the newest segment that's out there that some of you may have heard of is what they call active adult 55 plus rentals. So those are not the 55 plus real estate where folks can buy into, an age restricted community in your local town. These are rental apartments. So kind of the stage before IL, so that active adult 55 plus, and then IL, AL memory care, as well as the life planning CCRC community. So this works for everyone. It just depends on what your offering is. So for you that is offering AL and memory care, if you have a need for leads in both product types, then you'd want your targeted list to support both of those, and then you would want your presentation and invitation to speak to both of those segments.
Terrific. Just double check. We're actually running out of time, but thank you so much, Val. This was a terrific presentation, lots of great insight into what you have discovered running events, very successful events. Just wanted to let everyone know that we will be sending out a recording of the video as well as a transcript and the PowerPoint presentation. You should have that by the beginning of next week. Please take a moment after the webinar to respond to our survey to make sure that we're meeting your needs in terms of the education that you'd like to hear from. And there also is a handout. We will also send that out when we send out the recording, but you can go ahead in your control panel and download the Senior Living Q1 Trend Report. And again, don't forget to contact Val if you're interested in a marketing insight report. It has some terrific data to help you plan a very successful event. Val, thank you so much for your time today, and I look forward to your next webinar.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Take care.